The Germans had invented Tabin and sarin gas from studying the effects of jakefoot the Americans had suffered during Prohibition from poisoned alcohol. And the German people had been told that if they lost the war, Hitler would mercifully gas the whole country to spare them the shame of defeat, but as long as they refused to surrender, they'd be allowed to live a little while longer. While the first new German submarines were going into the water in the fall of 1944 in order to help the Japanese, bomb-proof underground oil refineries were gearing up both in Japan and in Germany, capable of producing 300,000 tons of synthetic gasoline every month. And in 4 or 5 months, the Germans could have been making jet planes in other underground factories, 1,000 or more every month, while the Allies had not even begun building a single jet aircraft. The complex at Nordhausen alone had 40 miles of underground tunnels making V-2 rockets and jet airplanes, and the Germans could have won the war if only they had fed their worker prisoners better. Russia would have been easily overrun in Barbarossa, except that the German army had to keep pausing for the SS Jew-killing squads to catch up, and the generals begged Hitler to allow their waiting soldiers to turn south and go after the Caucasian oil fields, because no German general wanted to march into Moscow, where there were so many Jews living that murdering them would have taken too much time, and the army would have had to become involved in that horrible business. So Hitler allowed half of his Barbarossa army to turn south, while the other half succumbed to the Russian winter, waiting for the SS to do their work. And while the Americans were keeping the Japanese from being able to attack Russia, the SS were being further slowed down by Russian peasants, cleverly, but not cleverly enough, hiding Jews in their basements and in their barns. Chief Müller. Oh yes, Stalin had commissars attached to all military units. Actually, they controlled them, even ordered the commanders of the units to obey them. Most of these officials were Jewish and had a reputation for being fanatical communists and very brutal. In fact, most of the higher level party people were Jews at that time. Gestapo chief, page 29. When the war continued to drag on, feeding the prisoners became more of a struggle than Germany could bear. And it seemed at the time more humane to send them to the scientific gas chambers than to allow them to starve to death, and shooting them outright had simply been too terrible to continue with the job. Extermination had not been the initial program because it had taken the Nazis 9 years to get to the extermination stage, after doing all they could to chase their victims out of the Reich, and 2/3 died in the camps, while 1/3 were murdered out in the open. In August of 1942, the Nazis had 800,000 people working for Germany in the scientifically designed camps, and by the next year they had increased that to 3.5 million. At the end of 1944, there were 7 million concentration camp inmates doing useful work, yet it was not enough, because Stalin had even more comrades working away for him, and yet neither leader could match the 65 million Americans pouring their hearts and souls into industrial labor towards winning the war, and 2.5 million of them were Rosie the Riveters. And to the war work was added the 11 million Americans serving in the armed forces. America was spending twice what Germany and Japan were paying combined, and Germany had begun to suffer as people were hired due to party loyalty rather than competence, and instead of rewarding good workers in the concentration camps, they were being punished for being Jew communists. The camps had been intended not only to support themselves, but also to make money for Germany. But the sabotage and escape attempts by prisoners made the idea of forced labor cumbersome and unproductive, and it took more effort to provide jobs for the prisoners than it did to simply police them. As the war wrenched down on Germany, the expense of disease-ridden inmates, The expense of disease-ridden inmates and the incredible volume of prisoners, now bloated with Russian POWs, was relieved only by the ratcheting up of the extermination program, where at least some of the inmates could be given something useful to do. In addition to collecting and sorting the belongings of new arrivals being unloaded from the trains, then registering them, delousing them, and providing them with prison uniforms, they could now be escorted to the gas chambers, and then the inmates were put to work disposing of the bodies, and this became the only actual labor performed within the barbed wire. The concentration camps had begun more like prisons than work centers because it took too much time to police the inmates rather than simply treating them as prisoners. Decent Germans working jobs outside the camps that could have been done by prison labor were doing those jobs at a much lower price than the cost of setting up factories inside the camps, and not only was bringing that work to within the confines of a concentration camp too expensive, but it supplanted the space needed to house the prisoners, so the design of many of the camps as being places of employment rather quickly went by the wayside. When more Germans working regular jobs had been needed as soldiers, the camp administrators had at first made attempts to provide useful work for the prison laborers, and all the Jew-bashing had gone a long way towards making it possible for inmates to be taken by truck every day to some work site needing hands now fighting on the battlefront, because being under guard by camp managers kept Jews safe from being attacked by the local people who were now all worked up as their kinsmen were being killed in action on the front lines. The same held true for Russian POWs, who were in danger for their very lives outside the safety of the concentration camps, and as the difficulty of creating jobs within the camps became an intolerable burden, the reality was that the employment programs behind the barbed wire were mostly for show to their superiors, as the work camps became mere places of punishment. Nazis were disgusted to see Jews die so easily while being transported to the camps, and they watched as Jews died more quickly in the camps than their Aryan brothers, and trains stopping in the middle of nowhere to throw out the dead were discouraged because it was interfering with Eichmann's careful timetables. The Nazis had believed that Jews would be unable to stand the effort of honest work because they'd only survived in the world thus far by being sneaky, and they were thought to be incapable of fighting in battle because they were weak. But Jews did not die quickly enough in the camps, so there would be more room for newcomers carrying booty, so the Nazis took away their coats and their shoes and their food and their medicine, and even with these efforts, Jews turned out to be just as hard to kill as other Germans. For every Jew killed, the Nazis intentionally killed 2 others to make it seem that they were not just killing Jews. And they'd started with Croatian, Russian, and Baltic Jews in 1941, and then did the French and Slovak Jews in March of 1942, then Polish and Austrian Jews in April, and the Dutch Jews in July, then the Yugoslavian and Belgian Jews in August, and the Czech Jews in October, followed by the Norwegian and German Jews in December. And nothing bad happened to those who refused to join in on the Jew killing, because whoever complained was simply transferred to another job. Some camps like Dachau were transfer points or hubs, and Sachsenhausen had been a brick factory, and Mauthausen was a granite quarry, and Buchenwald had been a limestone quarry, and Treblinka was a gravel pit, and Auschwitz had been known for its Jewish distillery that made famous vodka and brandies. Theresienstadt was set apart for special cases such as exceptionally wealthy Jews and the elderly, and to keep the cleansing and re-education of Germany going, the Nazis would recruit a few senior Jews to set up a Jewish association that would help any newcomers transfer all their money and financial assets into the safekeeping of the Jewish association, and after some months of gathering assets, the members of the Jewish association would be murdered and all the money given to the Reich, and then they would start all over again. The first deportation was on the 13th of February in 1940. and 1,300 Jews were taken by gunpoint from Stettin in Germany, and they were given a waiver to sign and then sent off to France, and the paper they'd signed said that their stuff was safe as long as they kept living in Germany. Jews eagerly signed the waivers to show the Germans how loyal they were, and this was a clever trick accomplished while the Germans were accusing them of being traitors who wanted to betray the fatherland by moving out of the country. This confiscation of Jewish property was accomplished because of the same spirit displayed when they had willingly and proudly donned the yellow star, not just to comply with the law, but to make it obvious to everyone what good German citizens they were. Warehouses filled up with furniture and valuables seized after people were arrested, and they were then made to sign inventories of their homes and assets to prove that they were not homeless beggars in need of being relocated, and then the Nazis put them onto trains and went back to empty out their houses and distribute their belongings. At first it had been more of an experiment to see how the neighbors would react, and nobody complained, and so it was safe to continue with the agenda, and that's how Jews ended up later in Auschwitz. The worst extermination camps were in Poland and in the East, because the Poles were more afraid of the Russians than they were of the Germans, and thus had seen no choice but to go along with what the Nazis were doing, and being good Catholics, giving the Jews in Poland a chance to turn from their wicked ways was certainly seen as a blessing. Hannah said that while Jews had been outsiders and devils, the rumors of world conspiracy were new, and that any charity or kindness or tolerance in Germany disappeared. Hannah Arendt said that there were two kinds of people, those who were horrified by the extermination of Jews, and those who thought it was tragic, but that they were only Jews, and wasn't it sad what was happening to them, but that the science of nature must be allowed to take its course. Hannah said that Berlin Jews were arrested by Jewish policemen, directed to the trains by Jewish organizers, walked into the gas chambers by Jewish capos, and their corpses disposed of by more Jews, and then other Jews had to dig up these dead bodies and try to burn them when the Americans turned the tide of the war. Bruno Bettelheim said it wasn't so much what the Germans did to the Jews that was so bad, but what they did to each other, and that while some behaved like monsters inside the camps, they would say that when they got out, things would be different. Bruno said the lower classes were delighted to be on an equal footing with the rich in the camps, and he said that the campers would daydream about messianic and apocalyptic things, and that they felt they would emerge as leaders after the ashes cooled. Eli Wiesel said that when he got to Auschwitz as a small child, he thought it might be Jerusalem, because it was, quote, the ingathering of the exiles, as Jews were coming from all parts of the diaspora. And so being put into the camps was a great joy, because they thought the Messiah would then come to rescue them just as soon as they had all been gathered together. Chief Mueller, as I said before, no one wanted them anywhere. The security service did have connections with the Zionists, who wanted Jews in Palestine to help build up their Zionist state. They would take them, but don't forget the British ran Palestine, and the Arabs there did not want any Jews at all. They all complained to Ribbentrop, who in turn ran to Hitler, and said the SS was sabotaging his foreign policy. Quite a few Jews were actually sent to Palestine, but finally the British threatened to sink the passenger boats, and they put diplomatic pressure on Hitler to stop the immigration. This attitude on the part of the British went on even during the war. There was a plan on the part of the SS to ship all the Jews in the camp system to Palestine or wherever someone would take them, but the British blocked this right along. One of them said something about no one wanting that many Polish Jews. They might have taken a few hundred German Jews or Danish Jews, but not several 100,000 Polish Jews. Of course, after the war was over, the British cried louder than anyone else about these poor Jews, most of whom had fled to Palestine. I was actually in charge of the main office for the emigration of Jews from the beginning of 1939 until about October that year, so I know exactly what I'm talking about. I finally saw that I could do nothing at all against such opposition, so I managed to find someone else to run the office and left it. Gestapo chief, page 74. The first footnote read, Lord Moyne, British High Commissioner in Cairo, when the Jewish terrorist Stern gang got wind of his blockage of the release of the Jewish camp inmates, they assassinated him. The second footnote read, Mueller turned this over to Adolf Eichmann, who served under him. The Nazis started gassing people in the camps because the other choice was to let them starve, since the Russians were not surrendering and the Germans were running out of food, and it took over 10 minutes for the people in the gas chambers to die. The crematorium were designed to burn 2 bodies at a time, but the people being burned in them were so starved that 4 of them would fit inside, and Auschwitz was burning 18 people per hour, but they simply couldn't keep up. The crematoria were the same as those designed to operate in any medical facility, not built for purposeful extermination, and the sheer number of corpses became an insurmountable challenge, and Hitler had seen the world fail to respond when Turkey killed most of the Armenians in the summer of 1915, and he believed there would be a minimal response to the disposing of criminals and Jews, and to a large extent he had been right. Jews had been told to leave Germany and were then called criminals and traitors for deserting the homeland, and it did not take long for the whole thing to spiral out of control, as human nature did indeed take its course. As the exterminations increased, the campers turned to hoping that the Germans would win the war so they would be allowed to live, since it was certain that they would all be murdered if the Germans lost, so as not to leave any witnesses. The slave laborers had proven their worth and knew the Germans would want to keep them, and so sabotage became even more rare in the work camps as the inmates acted as their own police. By the time Hitler had attacked Russia in Barbarossa, emigration had slowed to a crawl because people had stopped trying to go anywhere, with the Einsatzgruppen machine gunning people in the woods after herding them out of small towns, and it was not a good idea to travel. People just hunkered down and tried to be invisible, and anybody willing or able to move had already gone before fleeing Germany had become illegal. While many Jews had left Germany, more had stayed to prove the Nazis wrong about them, while sacrificing their poor Eastern cousins in Poland had been seen as a necessary evil in satisfying the demand for alien-looking Jews while keeping their own privilege of German citizenship. 1/3 of German Jews stayed in Germany, and most of them would die.